On the afternoon of January 6, 1977, a 21-year-old American man stood in front of a chain-link fence at the United States Embassy compound in Mexico City, clutching a package wrapped in brown paper. His name was Andrew Daulton Lee. He was a drug dealer from the beach communities of Los Angeles County. He was 5 feet 6 inches tall, thin, with shoulder-length brown hair and a mustache that didn't quite fill in properly. He'd been standing near the embassy entrance for approximately 15 minutes, pacing back and forth, trying to gather the courage to approach the guard station. Inside the package were 35mm film negatives containing classified documents related to American satellite reconnaissance systems. Lee was trying to sell them to the Soviet Union. Within the next 20 minutes, he would be arrested by Mexican police, setting in motion a chain of events that would expose one of the most damaging intelligence breaches of the Cold War era and destroy the lives of 2 young men who had once been altar boys together at a Catholic church in Palos Verdes, California. Christopher John Boyce had been 21 years old when he began stealing classified documents from his employer in December 1974. He was the son of a former FBI agent. He'd grown up in an upper-middle-class neighborhood in Palos Verdes Estates, a wealthy coastal community in Los Angeles County where houses sat on cliffs overlooking the Pacific Ocean and families sent their children to private Catholic schools. Boyce had attended St. John Fisher Elementary School and Palos Verdes High School. He'd been an altar boy at St. John Fisher Catholic Church. He'd been a Boy Scout. By all accounts, he'd been a polite, intelligent young man from a good family. His father, Charles Eugene Boyce, had worked in security for McDonnell Douglas and had connections throughout Southern California's aerospace and defense industry. His mother, Noreen, was a homemaker who raised Christopher and his siblings in a traditional Catholic household. Andrew Daulton Lee had grown up 3 blocks away from the Boyce family. He was exactly 1 year older than Christopher, born on January 3, 1952. His father, Daulton Lee Sr., was a physician in Palos Verdes. His mother, Anne, was also a homemaker. The Lee family lived in a large house on a quiet street lined with eucalyptus trees. Andrew had attended the same schools as Christopher. They'd served as altar boys together. They'd been friends since childhood, though their lives had begun to diverge significantly by the time they reached high school. Where Christopher excelled academically and seemed headed for college and a professional career, Andrew struggled with school and began experimenting with drugs in his mid-teens. By 16, he was dealing marijuana to classmates. By 18, he was trafficking cocaine and heroin to support his own growing addiction. The 2 young men had maintained their friendship despite their different paths. Christopher saw Andrew as someone who had been failed by the education system, someone intelligent who'd never been properly challenged or supported. Andrew saw Christopher as his connection to respectability, to the life he might have had if he'd made different choices. They spent time together talking about politics, philosophy, and their frustrations with American society. Both had become increasingly disillusioned with their country during the early 1970s. The Vietnam War was still being fought. Watergate had destroyed their faith in government integrity. Christopher, in particular, had developed strong anti-war sentiments and had come to believe that the American intelligence apparatus was fundamentally immoral. In the summer of 1974, Christopher Boyce was working a minimum-wage job at a sandwich shop in Redondo Beach, uncertain about his future. He'd attended college for a brief period but had dropped out, uninterested in the traditional path his parents envisioned for him. His father, concerned about his son's directionless state, used his connections in the defense industry to secure Christopher an interview at TRW Defense and Space Systems Group, a major aerospace contractor located in Redondo Beach. TRW held numerous classified government contracts related to satellite systems, missile technology, and communications infrastructure. The company needed young employees with security clearances to work in their classified facilities, and Charles Boyce's background as an FBI agent made his son an ideal candidate from a security perspective. Christopher was hired in July 1974 to work in TRW's, quote, Zero, a secured communications facility that handled classified message traffic between TRW and the CIA, the National Reconnaissance Office, and other intelligence agencies. The Black Vault was a windowless room approximately 20 feet by 30 feet, located in Building M4-095 at the TRW facility. It contained encryption machines, communications equipment, filing cabinets full of classified documents, and a safe where the most sensitive materials were stored. Access to the Black Vault required a top-secret security clearance with Special Compartmented Information, SCI, access. Christopher, because of his father's background and his own clean record, was granted this clearance after a standard background investigation. His job was straightforward but critical. He was a communications clerk responsible for receiving encrypted messages via TWX machines, decrypting them using KW7 cipher machines, routing them to the appropriate personnel at TRW, and then destroying the decrypted messages according to proper security protocols. He also handled outgoing classified communications, encrypting messages and transmitting them to various government agencies. The work was tedious and repetitive. Most days, Christopher worked alone in the vault for hours at a time, processing hundreds of messages. His supervisors rarely entered the vault. The security protocols assumed that anyone with access to the facility could be trusted completely. Within weeks of starting the job, Christopher began to understand the nature of the information passing through his hands. The messages related to a satellite system codenamed RHYOLITE, a constellation of advanced signals intelligence satellites that the United States was deploying to intercept Soviet communications and telemetry. These satellites represented some of the most sophisticated intelligence-gathering technology ever developed. They could intercept microwave communications, monitor Soviet missile tests, and even eavesdrop on telephone conversations in Soviet cities. The intelligence derived from RHYOLITE was considered so valuable that the very existence of the program was classified at one of the highest levels of secrecy in the American intelligence community. Christopher also handled communications related to Pyramider, the ground stations in Australia that controlled the RHYOLITE satellites. The messages discussed technical specifications, operational procedures, targeting priorities, and the intelligence being collected. Reading these communications, Christopher came to understand that the satellites were being used not only against the Soviet Union, but also to spy on Australia itself, despite Australia being a close American ally. This revelation troubled him deeply. He'd been raised to believe in American moral superiority, in the idea that the United States was fundamentally different from the authoritarian Soviet system. The discovery that his country routinely spied on its allies, that it operated a massive surveillance apparatus in secret, contradicted everything he'd been taught. By November 1974, Christopher had been working at TRW for approximately 4 months. He'd developed a routine. He'd arrive at the facility around 8 a.m., sign in at the security desk, proceed to the Black Vault, unlock the heavy steel door with his cipher key, and spend the next 8 hours processing classified communications. During breaks, he'd sometimes photograph documents using a Minox camera he'd purchased at a camera shop in Torrance. At first, this was simply an intellectual exercise, a way of preserving information he found interesting or disturbing. He didn't have a plan for what to do with the film. He stored the undeveloped rolls in a drawer at his apartment. During this period, Christopher was living in a small apartment in Hermosa Beach, about 20 minutes from the TRW facility. He spent his evenings reading about American foreign policy, intelligence operations, and Cold War history. He'd developed a particular interest in the works of authors critical of American imperialism. He saw himself as someone who had stumbled into secret knowledge, who understood truths about his government that ordinary citizens didn't. This knowledge made him feel both powerful and profoundly alienated from mainstream society. It was sometime in early December 1974 that Christopher mentioned the documents to Andrew Daulton Lee. The two friends were at Andrew's house in Palos Verdes, sitting in Andrew's bedroom, which his parents had allowed him to turn into a private space separate from the main house. Andrew was preparing shipments of cocaine to distribute to his network of dealers. Christopher was talking about his frustrations with his job, about the hypocrisy he'd discovered in the classified communications. He mentioned, almost casually, that he'd been photographing some of the documents. Andrew's response was immediate and practical. He asked if the documents might be worth money. Christopher initially dismissed the idea. He saw the documents as evidence of American wrongdoing, not as commodities to be sold. But Andrew persisted. He pointed out that if the information was truly valuable, if it truly exposed American misconduct, then the Soviet Union would want to know about it. And if the Soviets wanted it, they would pay for it. The money could be used to fund their lives, to free them from the wage slavery Christopher despised. They could use Soviet money to undermine the American system they'd both come to hate. The logic appealed to Christopher, though not primarily for financial reasons. He'd convinced himself that providing information to the Soviets was an act of ideological opposition, a way of balancing the scales in a world where American power was unchecked. He believed, or told himself he believed, that he was acting as a whistleblower, exposing American crimes by giving evidence to the one power capable of checking American ambitions. The fact that this power was a totalitarian state that had killed millions of its own citizens was something he either didn't think about carefully or rationalized away as Western propaganda. Andrew had no such ideological pretensions. He saw the scheme purely as a business opportunity. He was already engaged in international drug trafficking, already accustomed to taking risks for money. Selling secrets to the Russians seemed no different morally than selling cocaine to Americans. Both were illegal, both were dangerous, both were profitable. And Andrew, who'd developed a serious heroin addiction by this point, desperately needed money to fund his habit and maintain his lifestyle. The first contact with Soviet intelligence occurred in early January 1975. Christopher had photographed approximately 20 documents related to RHYOLITE and the Australian ground stations. Andrew, who traveled frequently to Mexico and Central America on drug-related business, volunteered to approach the Soviet embassy in Mexico City. He'd been to Mexico City several times before on drug runs and was comfortable navigating the city. Christopher, whose job required him to maintain a clean record and avoid any suspicious travel patterns, couldn't risk making contact himself. On January 12, 1975, Andrew walked into the Soviet embassy in Mexico City carrying an envelope containing several of the photographed documents, along with a letter Christopher had written explaining what the documents were and offering to provide additional information in exchange for payment. The letter was addressed to the KGB, though Andrew simply handed it to a receptionist and said he had information the Soviet government might find interesting. He was told to return the following day. When Andrew returned to the embassy on January 13th, he was met by a man who identified himself only as John. John was almost certainly a KGB officer working under diplomatic cover. He took Andrew to a private room and examined the documents. After approximately 30 minutes, John told Andrew that the information was indeed interesting and that the Soviet government would be willing to pay for additional materials of similar value. He gave Andrew $250 in cash and instructed him to return in 2 weeks with more documents. This established the basic pattern that would continue for the next 2 years. Christopher would photograph classified documents at TRW, carefully selecting materials he believed the Soviets would find valuable. He focused primarily on technical specifications for the RHYOLITE satellites, information about targeting priorities, details about ground station locations and capabilities, and various operational procedures. He would develop the film using equipment he purchased at a photography supply store, or sometimes he would give the undeveloped film directly to Andrew, who would carry it to Mexico City. Andrew would make trips to Mexico City approximately every 4 to 6 weeks. He would meet with Soviet handlers, usually at the embassy, but sometimes at predetermined locations around the city. The Soviets would examine the materials, pay Andrew in cash, and request specific types of information for future deliveries. The payments varied depending on the perceived value of the information, ranging from a few $100s to several $1,000s per delivery. Over the course of 2 years, the total payments amounted to approximately $77,000, though both Christopher and Andrew would later claim the amount was lower. The money was split between them, though not evenly. Andrew typically kept the larger share, arguing that he was taking the greater risk by actually making the deliveries. Christopher received enough to support himself and fund his increasingly expensive lifestyle. He'd moved from his small apartment to a larger place. He'd purchased a new car. He'd begun taking trips to Europe and spending money more freely than someone with his salary could normally afford. His parents noticed the change, but attributed it to raises at work or good fortune with investments. The espionage itself was remarkably unsophisticated, especially given the sensitivity of the information being compromised. Christopher's method was simply to photograph documents during his work shift, using a Minox camera small enough to conceal in his pocket. The Black Vault had no cameras monitoring the interior, and Christopher was often alone in the facility for hours at a time. When supervisors or other employees were present, he would simply wait until they left before retrieving documents from the filing cabinets or the safe. He had access to virtually everything in the vault. Security protocols assumed that access control was sufficient protection. The possibility that someone with proper clearance might betray his trust was considered but deemed sufficiently unlikely that additional internal security measures weren't implemented. Christopher was careful to photograph documents in ways that wouldn't immediately reveal their absence. He never removed original documents from the facility. He would photograph them during his shift and return them to their proper places. He avoided taking the same document multiple times, reasoning that a missing document might trigger an investigation, while photographed documents would leave no trace. This calculation was correct from a practical standpoint, but reflected a profound misunderstanding of counterintelligence methodology. The damage from compromised information doesn't require the physical theft of documents. Once the Soviets possessed the information, the damage was done regardless of whether the original papers remained in their filing cabinets. The operation might have continued indefinitely if not for Andrew's increasing recklessness and deteriorating mental state. By late 1976, Andrew's heroin addiction had progressed to the point where it was affecting his judgment and behavior. He was using significant portions of the Soviet payments to purchase drugs for his own use. His paranoia was increasing. He'd begun to suspect that American intelligence agencies were following him, that his drug dealing had attracted law enforcement attention, that his Soviet contacts might betray him. Some of this paranoia was justified. The Drug Enforcement Administration had indeed opened an investigation into Andrew's activities based on informant reports of his drug trafficking, though they had no knowledge of his espionage activities. Christopher became concerned about Andrew's reliability. During their meetings, Andrew would sometimes arrive high, would talk too much, would suggest increasingly risky schemes to maximize their profits from the Soviets. Christopher tried to convince Andrew to stop using heroin, or at least to moderate his behavior, but Andrew was defensive and resentful of what he perceived as Christopher's judgment of him. The friendship that had sustained their partnership was fraying under the pressure of their criminal activities and Andrew's addiction. In December 1976, Christopher told Andrew that he wanted to end their arrangement with the Soviets. He'd been working at TRW for more than 2 years. He'd saved enough money to quit his job and pursue other interests. He was tired of the stress, tired of the constant fear of discovery, and increasingly uncomfortable with what he was doing. His ideological justifications had worn thin. He'd begun to recognize that he wasn't a whistleblower or a political activist. He was a spy who'd sold his country's secrets for money, and the weight of that recognition was becoming unbearable. Andrew reacted badly to this news. He needed the Soviet payments to fund his drug habit. His drug-dealing operation had become less profitable as his addiction consumed more of his product. He'd come to depend on the espionage income as his primary source of funds. He told Christopher that he couldn't just walk away, that the Soviets wouldn't allow it, that they were both committed now and had to continue. Christopher refused. He said he was done, that Andrew would have to find another source of income. They argued. Their friendship, already strained, reached a breaking point. Andrew decided to make one final delivery to Mexico City without Christopher's involvement. He gathered materials Christopher had already photographed, some undeveloped film rolls, and some documents Christopher had mentioned but hadn't yet provided. On December 28, 1976, Andrew flew from Los Angeles to Mexico City. He was carrying approximately 15 rolls of undeveloped film containing classified documents hidden in various locations throughout his luggage and on his person. He was also carrying a small amount of cocaine, which he planned to sell to cover his expenses in Mexico City. The delivery attempt on January 6, 1977, was a disaster from the beginning. Andrew had arranged to meet his Soviet contact at a predetermined location, but the contact didn't appear at the scheduled time. Andrew waited for more than 2 hours, growing increasingly anxious and paranoid. When his contact finally did arrive, he told Andrew that there had been complications, that they needed to reschedule for the following day, that Andrew should return to his hotel and wait for further instructions. But Andrew, desperate for money and spiraling into withdrawal, decided he couldn't wait. He went directly to the Soviet embassy compound on January 6th in broad daylight. Carrying the package of film, this was explicitly against the protocols the Soviets had established. Embassy facilities were under constant surveillance by Mexican and American intelligence services. Approaching the embassy with classified materials was exactly the kind of behavior that would attract attention. Andrew stood outside the embassy fence for approximately 15 minutes, trying to decide what to do. Mexican police officers stationed near the embassy noticed him. He was acting suspiciously, pacing back and forth, clutching a package, looking nervous. One officer approached and asked him what he was doing. Andrew claimed he was trying to deliver a package to someone inside the embassy. The officer asked to see identification. Andrew produced his American passport and the package. The officer asked what was in the package. Andrew said it contained papers, personal correspondence. The officer asked him to open it. When Andrew refused, the officer detained him and called for backup. Within minutes, Andrew was surrounded by several Mexican police officers. They searched him and found the package containing the film negatives, approximately $6,000 in cash, his passport, and a small amount of cocaine. He was arrested and taken to a police station in Mexico City. The package was confiscated as evidence. The Mexican authorities initially treated Andrew's arrest as a drug case. He was booked on charges of cocaine possession. The film and papers were set aside as potential evidence but weren't immediately examined. Andrew was held in a Mexican jail cell overnight. He was terrified. He believed the Mexicans would turn him over to American authorities, that his drug dealing would be exposed, that he would face serious prison time. What he didn't yet understand was that his situation was far worse than he imagined. The following morning, January 7th, Mexican intelligence officers examined the film that had been confiscated from Andrew. They developed several rolls and discovered that they contained photographs of classified American documents. The documents had markings indicating top-secret classification levels and compartmented access restrictions. The Mexican authorities immediately contacted the American embassy in Mexico City and informed them that they had arrested an American citizen who appeared to be in possession of classified intelligence materials. The FBI's legal attaché at the American embassy in Mexico City was notified within hours. Special Agent Thomas O. Spencer was responsible for FBI operations in Mexico and for liaison with Mexican law enforcement on cases involving American citizens. When he received the information about Andrew's arrest and the nature of the materials found in his possession, he understood immediately that this was a major espionage case. He contacted FBI headquarters in Washington and requested that agents be dispatched to Mexico City to conduct the investigation. Andrew was interrogated by Mexican authorities with FBI agents present on January 8, 1977. He was shown the photographs of the classified documents and asked where he'd obtained them. He initially claimed he didn't know what the documents were, that he'd been asked to deliver a package for someone else, that he was just a courier. The interrogators didn't believe him. They pointed out that he'd been attempting to enter the Soviet embassy, that he'd been carrying thousands of dollars in cash, that the documents were clearly American intelligence materials. They asked him again where he'd gotten the documents. After several hours of interrogation, Andrew broke. He was exhausted, in withdrawal from heroin, terrified of what would happen to him. He told the interrogators that he'd gotten the documents from a friend who worked at a defense contractor in Los Angeles. He said his friend had access to classified materials and had been selling information to the Soviets for approximately 2 years. When asked for the friend's name, Andrew hesitated. Then he gave them Christopher John Boyce's name and address. The FBI office in Los Angeles received notification of Andrew's confession on the evening of January 8th. Agents immediately began surveillance of Christopher Boyce. They obtained his employment records from TRW and confirmed that he worked in a facility with access to highly classified information. They obtained a warrant to search his apartment in Hermosa Beach and began planning his arrest. On the morning of January 16, 1977, 8 days after Andrew's confession in Mexico City, FBI agents arrived at the TRW facility in Redondo Beach. They met with TRW security personnel and requested that Christopher Boyce be brought to a conference room for questioning. Christopher was working in the Black Vault when security contacted him via telephone and told him he was needed in Building M1 for a meeting. He locked the vault and walked across the facility to the conference room, where he was met by 2 FBI agents who identified themselves and asked him to sit down. The agents told Christopher that Andrew Daulton Lee had been arrested in Mexico City and had confessed to selling classified information to the Soviet Union. They told Christopher that Andrew had identified him as the source of that information. They asked Christopher if he wanted to make a statement. Christopher, according to the FBI's account of the interview, sat silently for approximately 30 seconds. Then he said, Quote 2, Christopher was arrested and charged with espionage later that day. FBI agents searched his apartment and found photography equipment, Minox cameras, classified documents that he'd somehow managed to remove from the TRW facility, despite his later claims that he never took documents home, and approximately $13,000 in cash. They also found notebooks containing what appeared to be encoded notes about his Soviet contacts and his espionage activities. The evidence was overwhelming. Meanwhile, Andrew had been extradited from Mexico to the United States. He was transported to Los Angeles and held at the Metropolitan Detention Center. He was charged with espionage, conspiracy to commit espionage, and multiple counts related to the unauthorized possession and transmission of classified information. The charges carried a maximum sentence of life imprisonment. The case against both men was built primarily on Andrew's confession and the physical evidence seized from Christopher's apartment and from Andrew at the time of his arrest. The FBI conducted an extensive damage assessment to determine what information had been compromised and what impact it might have on national security. The assessment concluded that Christopher and Andrew had provided the Soviet Union with information that compromised the RHYOLITE satellite program, exposed American signals intelligence capabilities, revealed the locations and capabilities of ground stations in Australia, and provided details about American satellite reconnaissance techniques that would allow the Soviets to develop countermeasures. The damage was considered catastrophic. The RHYOLITE program had cost billions of dollars to develop and deploy. The intelligence it provided had been central to American understanding of Soviet military capabilities, nuclear weapons development, and strategic planning. With the program compromised, the Soviets could alter their communications practices to avoid interception, could develop jamming techniques to interfere with the satellites, and could potentially target the satellites for destruction in the event of war. The ground stations in Australia became security liabilities. The entire strategic intelligence apparatus that had been built around RHYOLITE was undermined. The financial cost of the breach was estimated in the billions of dollars. The strategic cost was considered incalculable. Intelligence analysts concluded that the United States had lost years of advantage in the satellite reconnaissance and signals intelligence competition with the Soviet Union. Some analysts believed that the breach might have shifted the strategic balance of the Cold War in subtle but significant ways, giving the Soviets increased confidence in their ability to conceal military developments and potentially making them more willing to take risks in geopolitical confrontations. Christopher and Andrew were held without bail as their cases moved through the legal system. Both were appointed federal public defenders, though Christopher's family eventually hired a private attorney to represent him. The attorneys faced the difficult task of defending clients whose guilt was not seriously in question and whose crimes had caused enormous damage to national security. The prosecution had overwhelming evidence. The best strategy available was to negotiate plea agreements that might result in somewhat reduced sentences in exchange for cooperation with the ongoing damage assessment. Christopher's attorney argued that his client had been motivated by ideological opposition to American foreign policy rather than by greed, that he had genuinely believed he was acting as a whistleblower rather than as a spy. This argument found little sympathy with prosecutors or with the judge who would eventually sentence him. The fact that Christopher had accepted money for the classified information undermined claims of pure ideological motivation. The fact that he had provided the information to the Soviet Union, a totalitarian adversary, rather than to journalists or members of Congress, undermined claims that he was acting as a whistleblower. Andrew's attorney had an even more difficult case. Andrew had no ideological justification for his actions. He'd sold secrets purely for money to fund his drug addiction. His confession had implicated Christopher and had provided the FBI with most of its evidence against both of them. The best his attorney could hope for was to argue for some leniency based on Andrew's addiction and his cooperation with investigators. The trial began in United States District Court in Los Angeles in April 1977. Christopher and Andrew were tried together before Judge Robert J. Kelleher. The prosecution called numerous witnesses, including FBI agents who had arrested Andrew in Mexico City, TRW security personnel who described the access Christopher had to classified materials, and intelligence analysts who explained the damage that had been done by the breach. The defense called few witnesses. The evidence was too strong to contest seriously. On April 28, 1977, after a trial lasting 3 weeks, the jury deliberated for less than 5 hours before returning guilty verdicts against both defendants on all counts. Christopher John Boyce, 24 years old, and Andrew Daulton Lee, 25 years old, were convicted of espionage and conspiracy to commit espionage. Sentencing was scheduled for September 1977. The prosecutors recommended life imprisonment for both defendants, arguing that the severity of their crimes and the damage they had caused warranted the maximum possible sentence. The defense attorneys argued for more lenient sentences, pointing to the defendants' youth, their lack of prior criminal records, and in Andrew's case, his cooperation with investigators. On September 12, 1977, Judge Kelleher sentenced Christopher Boyce to 40 years in federal prison. He sentenced Andrew Daulton Lee to life imprisonment. The disparity in sentences reflected the judge's view that while Christopher had initiated the espionage and had provided the classified materials, Andrew had been the one who actually delivered the information to the Soviets and had been motivated purely by greed rather than by any ideological belief, however misguided. The sentences shocked both young men and their families. Christopher's parents, who had attended every day of the trial, were devastated. Charles Boyce, the former FBI agent who had used his connections to get his son a job at TRW, blamed himself for putting Christopher in a position where he had access to classified information. Noreen Boyce struggled to understand how her son, the altar boy who had once seemed destined for success, had become a convicted spy. Andrew's parents were equally destroyed. Dr. Daulton Lee Sr. had watched his son deteriorate through addiction and criminal behavior for years, but he had never imagined it would end with a life sentence for espionage. Christopher was sent to the federal penitentiary at Lompoc, California, a medium-security facility about 150 miles north of Los Angeles. Andrew was sent to the United States Penitentiary at Marion, Illinois, a maximum security facility that housed some of the most dangerous federal prisoners in the country. The separation meant that the two friends who had grown up together, served as altar boys together, and committed espionage together would never see each other again. Christopher's time in prison was marked by continued defiance of authority. He was not a model prisoner. He struggled with the restrictions and routines of incarceration. He maintained his belief that he had been wrongly imprisoned, that his actions had been justified by American misconduct. This self-justification allowed him to preserve some sense of dignity, but prevented him from confronting the actual nature of what he'd done. On January 21, 1980, after serving less than 3 years of his sentence, Christopher Boyce escaped from Lompoc. The escape occurred during a period when he was working in a low-security area of the facility. He simply walked away from his work detail, climbed over a fence, and disappeared into the surrounding countryside. A massive manhunt was launched. Federal marshals, FBI agents, and local law enforcement searched the area around Lompoc for weeks. Christopher was not found. For the next 19 months, Christopher Boyce was a fugitive. He survived by robbing banks. Between his escape in January 1980 and his recapture in August 1981, he committed approximately 17 bank robberies in Idaho and Washington state, stealing a total of approximately $45,000. He adopted various aliases and moved frequently, staying in cheap motels and rental apartments, constantly alert for law enforcement. During this period, he later claimed, he had time to reflect on what he'd done, on the damage he'd caused, on the path his life had taken. Whether this reflection led to any genuine remorse or change in perspective is unclear from his later statements. Christopher was recaptured on August 21, 1981, when U.S. Marshals tracked him to a location in Port Angeles, Washington, based on informant information. He was arrested without incident while eating dinner at a restaurant. He was returned to federal custody and charged with escape and with the bank robberies he'd committed while a fugitive. These new charges added years to his sentence. In 1982, Christopher was convicted of escape and multiple counts of bank robbery. He was sentenced to an additional 25 years in federal prison to be served consecutively with his original 40-year sentence. He was transferred to the United States Penitentiary at Marion, the same facility where Andrew Daulton Lee was incarcerated. Though they were kept in separate units and did not have contact, Andrew, meanwhile, had spent his imprisonment in a very different way. He had not attempted escape. He had, according to prison records, been a relatively compliant prisoner who participated in educational programs and religious services. He maintained contact with his family through letters and occasional visits. His parents visited him as often as the prison allowed. Making the long trip from California to Illinois despite their advancing age and declining health. The visits were painful. Andrew's father would later describe watching his son age in prison, watching him transform from a young man into a middle-aged prisoner with no realistic hope of release. The question of responsibility in cases like this is complicated because it requires us to assign blame among individuals who were all to some degree acting according to the logic of the system they lived in. Christopher Boyce was raised in a society that told him America was morally superior, that intelligence work was about protecting freedom, that secrecy served democracy. When he discovered that reality was more complex, when he found evidence of hypocrisy and surveillance of allies, he responded by betraying everything to America's primary adversary. This was not a whistleblower's choice. This was not a conscientious objector's stand. This was a young man's arrogant certainty that he understood the world better than anyone else, combined with a willingness to profit from that certainty. Andrew Daulton Lee was raised in privilege and threw it away for drugs. His espionage was purely mercenary. He had no political justification, no ideological cover. He was a heroin addict who sold his country's secrets to fund his habit, and yet he was the one who spent decades in prison, while Christopher, despite his escape and additional crimes, would eventually see freedom again. The families of both men were also victims in their own way. Charles and Noreen Boyce had done everything they thought was right in raising their son. They'd provided him with education, values, opportunity, and support. They'd used their connections to help him get a good job, and they'd watched as he used that opportunity to commit treason. The guilt and shame they experienced was profound. Charles Boyce, the former FBI agent, had to live with the knowledge that his son had betrayed the very institutions he had spent his career serving. Dr. and Mrs. Lee experienced a similar devastation. Their son's addiction had already caused them years of pain before the espionage conviction. The life sentence meant they would likely never see their son free again. Dr. Lee died in 1985 while his son was still imprisoned at Marion. Mrs. Lee continued visiting until her health no longer permitted travel. The broader question of what the case revealed about American security practices was never adequately addressed in public forums. How could a 21-year-old communications clerk with minimal training and supervision be given unrestricted access to some of the most sensitive intelligence information in the American government? How could he photograph documents for 2 years without anyone noticing? The answer was that the security system relied almost entirely on personnel vetting and access control. The assumption was that anyone who had been properly investigated and granted a clearance could be trusted completely. Internal monitoring, document tracking, random security checks, all of these were considered either impractical or unnecessary. Christopher Boyce's Betrayal demonstrated that this assumption was dangerously naive. But rather than fundamentally rethinking the security model, the response was primarily to increase the severity of punishment for breaches and to add some additional monitoring without addressing the core vulnerability: that trusted insiders with access to classified information are in a position to cause catastrophic damage before they're detected. The human cost extended beyond the immediate families. The intelligence professionals who had worked on RHYOLITE, who had spent years developing the technology and the operational procedures, had to watch as their work was compromised. The analysts who depended on RHYOLITE intelligence had to adjust their assessments of Soviet capabilities based on the assumption that the Soviets now knew they were being monitored. The diplomatic relationship with Australia was strained by the revelation that American intelligence had been spying on Australian communications. Trust between agencies and between allied nations was damaged in ways that took years to repair. Christopher Boyce was released from federal prison on March 15, 2003, after serving 25 years of his sentence. He was 50 years old. The world he emerged into was profoundly different from the one he'd left. The Cold War had ended. The Soviet Union had collapsed. The ideological conflict that had formed the background of his crimes no longer existed in the same form. He settled in Oregon, where he took a job and attempted to build a normal life. He married. He largely avoided public attention, though he did give occasional interviews about his case. In these interviews, Christopher expressed regret for his actions, though the nature of his regret seemed focused more on the consequences for himself and his family than on the damage he'd caused to national security or to the people who depended on the intelligence systems he'd compromised. He maintained that he'd been motivated by opposition to American imperialism, but he acknowledged that providing information to the Soviets had been a profound moral error. Whether this acknowledgment represented genuine understanding or merely the wisdom of hindsight shaped by 25 years in prison is difficult to determine. Andrew Daulton Lee remained in prison for 40 years. He was finally released on parole in 1998 at the age of 46 after serving 21 years. His life sentence had been commuted based on his good behavior in prison and changes in federal sentencing guidelines. He returned to California and lived quietly, working various jobs and maintaining a low profile. Unlike Christopher, he gave very few interviews and seemed to want nothing more than to forget his past and live out his remaining years in peace. The two men never reconciled. The friendship that had sustained them through childhood, through their criminal partnership, and through their initial arrests did not survive the years of imprisonment and the weight of what they'd done. Each blamed the other to some degree. Christopher believed Andrew's recklessness had led to their capture. Andrew believed Christopher's ideological pretensions had dragged them both into a situation that destroyed their lives. Both were right. Both were wrong. Their story became the subject of books and a film. Robert Lindsay's book, published in 1979, presented a detailed account of the case based on extensive interviews and court records. The book was adapted into a film in 1985, starring Timothy Hutton as Christopher Boyce and Sean Penn as Andrew Daulton Lee. The film presented Christopher as a disillusioned idealist and Andrew as a drug-addled accomplice, a framing that aligned with how Christopher preferred to see himself, but that oversimplified the moral reality of what both men had done. The actual story is messier and more troubling than the film version. Two privileged young men from wealthy families in Southern California, both intelligent, both with opportunities that most people never receive, both chose to betray their country. One did so while telling himself he was acting on principle. The other did so openly for money and drugs. Both caused enormous damage. Both destroyed their own lives and damaged their families. Both spent decades in prison, and in the end, neither achieved anything remotely resembling what they claimed to want. Christopher Boyce had opposed American imperialism and wanted to expose American hypocrisy. His actions did not advance either goal. They did not lead to any reform of intelligence practices. They did not spark any national conversation about surveillance or accountability. They simply provided the Soviet Union with information that strengthened its position in the Cold War while damaging American security. If Christopher had genuinely wanted to expose wrongdoing, he could have taken his evidence to journalists, to Congress, to oversight bodies. Instead, he sold it to America's adversary and pocketed the money. Andrew Daulton Lee had wanted money to fund his drug addiction. He got the money. He also got a life sentence and lost 21 years to federal prison. The heroin he bought with Soviet payments provided temporary relief from his psychological pain while ensuring that his actual life would be defined by far greater suffering. The children both men might have had, the families they might have built, the productive work they might have done, all of this was foreclosed by their choices. Christopher was 24 when he was sentenced. Andrew was 25. They were barely adults. They made catastrophically bad decisions that determined the course of the rest of their lives. Charles Boyce died in 2001, 2 years before his son's release from prison. He never stopped visiting Christopher during his incarceration. He never stopped believing that, despite everything, his son was redeemable. Noreen Boyce lived long enough to see Christopher released and to meet his wife, though she died in 2008. 5 years after his release. The question of whether she ever truly understood why her son had done what he did remains open. Ann Lee, Andrew's mother, died in 1992 while her son was still imprisoned. She had spent 15 years visiting him at Marion, watching him age behind bars, hoping for a commutation that seemed impossible. She never saw him free. Dr. Daulton Lee had died 7 years earlier, also without seeing his son released. The satellite systems that Christopher and Andrew compromised were eventually replaced with more advanced technology. The intelligence gaps their betrayal created were filled over time. The strategic damage was absorbed and adapted to. The American intelligence apparatus continued its work. The Cold War ended. The world moved on, but the human damage persisted. The families who were destroyed, the young men who threw away their lives, The trust that was broken between parents and children, between friends, between a nation and its citizens who hold security clearances. These damages don't have solutions or replacements. They remain as permanent scars, evidence of choices that can't be unmade, and consequences that can't be undone. Christopher John Boyce was 21 years old when he began photographing classified documents in the Black Vault at TRW. He was 50 years old when he walked out of federal prison. In between, he lost 29 years. Andrew Daulton Lee was 22 when he first walked into the Soviet embassy in Mexico City. He was 46 when he was finally released on parole. In between, he lost 24 years, and what they gained was nothing. Money spent on drugs and flights to Mexico, a sense of ideological righteousness that couldn't survive even casual scrutiny, and the knowledge that they had damaged their country, betrayed their families, and destroyed their own futures for reasons that, in the end, satisfied no one, not even themselves.